I will kick off by introducing me for anybody that doesn't know me. I'm Nick and I head the employment team at a law firm called Actons, and we're really pleased to have Angela along today. Angela will introduce herself in detail later on, but Angela is a coach and a menopause expert, and this is the second of the menopause webinars that we've done together, and the first one went down so well, we decided to do another one, and obviously something called menopause action plans also came into fruition, and we've been kind of trailing that for a while, so we're going to talk about those today. In terms of me and my team, we work with a whole range of different clients across the UK, varying different sizes. We do a fair amount on LinkedIn, me in particular. Angela's using it, roll her eyes at this point. If you do use LinkedIn at all, then do connect with the team there. I usually try and pick on Laura, but perhaps Darcy, if you've got a smartphone and you fancy connecting with Darcy, I'm sure she would be really pleased to get an invite to connect. You're going to see a bit more of her on LinkedIn. I'm taking her on as my protege on LinkedIn, which would be great. And the reason that we push that so hard is that actually, particularly with the Employment Rights Act at the minute, there's so much changing so quickly that we do put a lot of information out there, which hopefully is useful for our HR audience. And it's a good way of keeping up to date. The changes are happening so quickly at times that a kind of newsletter or that kind of update isn't really enough to keep up to speed with the changes. So even if you do dip in and out of LinkedIn a little bit, now might be a time to dip in a bit more and follow people who are sharing that kind of information so that you're aware of what's going on. The other thing before we get started, I always just like to plug is the podcast that I have the pleasure of hosting. The latest episode is with Kim Knight, who was at Coventry University. A great discussion, and it would be great if you would have a listen. Hopefully it's useful. It's basically sharing senior HR people's journey into HR and their experience in kind of progressing through their careers, and also talking about some issues of the day, as I often describe them. And Avetta's very kindly put a link in to the podcast there in the chat. You can also ask your smart speaker and find it pretty much on any streaming service. We've got it absolutely everywhere. So it would be good if you would like to follow that. To the topic of today, menopause. This one is particularly, something that I'm particularly passionate about, partly for personal reasons, on the basis that I've been quite open about sharing the journey that my wife and I have been on with menopause, and the fact that we didn't really know what menopause was, and that caused quite a lot of confusion when she started experiencing symptoms in her sort of early 40s. And I've committed to regularly sharing that story on LinkedIn, so I don't think Avetta will have a link to that necessarily, but I'll pull that off my LinkedIn profile, and I'd be really pleased if you would have a read and share it with anybody who you think it might be useful for. Another podcast, which you can see some details there, and I'll share, picked up on that and asked me to come and talk about that with some other menopause experts, and I was really pleased to do that, and again share the story of how that went. So if that is of interest, then do check those out too. But for today, we're going to talk about preparing for menopause action plans. And this is the point at which I'll hand over to Angela, and she's going to take us through some really, really good stuff in this area. And I'll let you take control, Angela, of the slides.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Let's see if I can actually get it working. I can. Marvelous. It's all working. All right, good morning, everybody. No pressure at all, some really good stuff. Hopefully I can step up and make sure this is really useful for you. So lovely to be here. Thank you to Nick and the team for having me, for all of you joining. Great to see so many of you here wanting to learn about this. It's a really exciting time for me because I'm so passionate about this subject. And I thought I would start by giving you a little bit of context about me, because it does explain why I now do this work and why it's so important to me, and why I am so passionate about getting more education and more support on the subject of menopause into as many organisations globally as I can. 50% of the population will go through the menopause at some point, but every single one of us is going to be affected by it too. Every single man knows a woman who is going through their menopause, whether they realize it yet or not. And it will be impacting and changing your relationships in ways that are hard to comprehend. Now, I've obviously not been doing this work my whole career. I spent 25 years working in retail. Most of that time was in senior roles. I was a merchandising director for a long time. So I've worked in fairly fast-paced environments where you are expected to be on top of things, making decisions and leading teams. And for a long, long time, that felt so natural to me. I absolutely loved what I did. But then in my early 40s, aged sort of 40 to 42, things started to feel really different. And at the time, I had absolutely no idea that it was anything to do with perimenopause. I just knew that I didn't feel like me. That's all I could say. I just don't feel like me. But it wasn't an overnight change in me. This was a long, slow and subtle change over a 2-year period. It also wasn't anything that anyone would have recognised at the time as related to menopause at all. It was all inside me. It was psychological symptoms that were slowly eating away at my confidence and belief in my abilities. And I can literally feel the palpitations, this always happens to me, in my chest as I recall those feelings that I was experiencing at the time. They were so bad. And over time, that had a huge impact on how I felt at work, to the point that I decided that I had no choice but to walk away. And in all honesty, that is it. I had no choice in the matter. I had got so desperate that I would have done anything to get away from the panic that I was feeling. Looking back on it now, with the understanding and the knowledge that I have, it wasn't because I couldn't do the job. Of course I could do the job. I've been doing it for years. I was really good at it. It was because I didn't understand what was happening to me. And there wasn't anything or anyone around me that helped me to make sense of it. So that is why I do this now. That is why I am so passionate about it. So I am now, as a result of that change, an ICF accredited and executive transformation coach. Coaching is what I am hugely passionate about, and a menopause workplace consultant, because I want to be able to spread that information and education. And I support organisations and the senior female leaders in those organisations through exactly this stage of their careers. And what I see again and again is that this isn't understood at all. It's very easy for changes in behaviour to be misread as something else entirely, but not just by our leaders and our managers. It's by the women themselves that are experiencing these changes. And that's when things start to go off track for both the individual and the organisation. So what I want to do today is to focus on that side of things. I'm not going to talk about the symptoms at all and what perimenopause is, but I want to focus on what that actually looks like in the workplace and what you might already be seeing and how to think about it in a way that helps you respond in a more practical and grounded way for your employees. And I would just say, I'm not going to talk about what menopause is and the symptoms, but if you do have any questions on all of that, please put them in the chat, and at the end I will come back to that and I can answer any questions that you might specifically have on that part of the subject. So moving on from my experience, I wanted to start with really what this actually can look like inside your organisation from a manager's point of view, because menopause, and especially perimenopause, doesn't show up in an obvious way. It doesn't usually start with someone saying, I'm struggling with menopause and I need support. That is just not going to happen. Maybe one day, hopefully one day, women will feel like they can do that. But right now, that is not what's going to happen. It shows up much earlier than that, through very small and subtle changes in behavior. And those changes can be quite easily misread if you don't know what you're looking at. So you might have someone in the organization who has always been really confident, very reliable, very clear in how she works, someone who's probably built, really strong reputation over many, many years. And then something starts to change for her. And as I say, it will likely be very subtle at first. It might be that she just stops speaking up as much in meetings. You might just notice she's gone a little bit quiet. She might take much longer before she's making important decisions. She might be asking for some reassurance that you've never seen her need to do that before. There'll be subtle changes that they're not symptoms, right? And so to others around her, it will look like her confidence has dipped. But for her herself, she may not understand why either. She just feels that work suddenly feels harder than it used to, or maybe that it needs to be. Then we've got the slower thinking. Sorry. Quite often, slower thinking we call brain fog. So I know brain fog can sound a bit like a throwaway phrase, and I do think that brain fog is sort of overused as a term. But for women that experience it, because it is real, it can be really unsettling. It can look like you're losing your train of thought halfway through a meeting, or needing time to process information, forgetting your words, which I do all the time, or feeling as though your brain isn't just working at the speed you expect it to, or that you need it to. And if that happens to someone who is used to being really on it, she's normally really sharp and quick and capable and able to hold a lot of information all at once, that is going to knock her confidence. She is going to really feel that. But if the people around her don't understand what might be happening, they might read that as disengagement. They might think of it as lack of focus, or she's just not simply on top of things anymore. So that's a really sad place to be. Then you might start to see patterns in absence. So this might not look like long-term sickness absence. It probably won't. It might be a day here, a day there, but normally that wouldn't happen. She's, always there, but suddenly there's a day here or a day there. It might get recorded that she's suffering a migraine, or she's just not feeling very well. Maybe she's saying she feels like she's got the flu. And of course, all of that might be true. Of course it will. But if we're not joining the dots and seeing the underlying patterns, they're going to get missed. And then there's this withdrawal from visibility. And I think this is one that can really get missed, especially when we're looking at leadership progression. So a woman may stop putting herself forward for opportunities. She might be avoiding presentations or high-profile meetings that you would expect her to want to be at. She may not apply for a new opportunity that's come up that she's really capable of doing. She's just stepping back from that whole conversation around progression. And you might just think, oh, well, she's just made that choice. She just doesn't want it. It can look like that she's just decided, actually, no, this isn't for me anymore. But that might not be true at all. She might just feel that she's not capable, because underneath that, there is probably anxiety, exhaustion, poor sleep, brain fog, loss of confidence, and possibly a genuine fear that she can't trust herself to deliver in the way that she used to. And I think that's where we have to be really careful, because these behaviours often appear before anybody has even considered naming menopause or perimenopause as a possible factor for the changes. The woman herself has probably not connected it. Her manager is very unlikely to have connected it. And HR might only ever get sight of the issues that are starting to arise once it's become more complicated already. In most cases, the first person to notice the change is going to be the line manager. That manager may see that hesitation, the lower confidence, the absence, the withdrawal. They may start thinking, we have a problem here in terms of performance, attitude, workload, stress, disengagement. All those words are very negative, right? But if hormonal change is also part of that picture and the cause, and nobody is considering it, then the response to her change can miss the point entirely, and she's not going to get the support that she needs. So this is why, for me, awareness alone is not enough. People do need to understand symptoms. Of course we do, and there's a lot of them to get our heads around. But organisations also need to understand how those symptoms can translate into workplace behaviour, because that is what usually the managers are going to see first. So, if this is already showing up in organisations, even when it's not being named as menopause yet, the next question is, well, why does this matter so much now? Because let's face it, menopause in the workplace is not new. Women have been going through the menopause in the workplace forever, right? But what is new is the level of visibility it's starting to have and the expectation that organisations do something more structured about it. So up until recently, this would have been likely handled in a fairly informal way. If someone did raise it, it might be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. That is if she was even able to raise it in the first place, which again is highly unlikely, right? So the experience would definitely vary a lot depending on where someone sits in the organisation and who they report into. What's changing now is that this is starting to move into something more formal. So for organisations with 250 or more employees, menopause action plans are now here on a voluntary basis. We're already in that phase. They came in at the beginning of April. And then the expectation is that we'll be moving to mandatory from 2027. So we now have a very clear direction of travel. But I think what's more important than the timeline is how this is being positioned. Because this isn't being introduced as a standalone wellbeing initiative. This isn't a wellbeing initiative. It's being linked to the gender pay gap reporting. So most organisations of this size are already used to looking at your gender pay gap. They're analysing their data. They're trying to understand what is driving it and explaining what they're doing in response. So, of course, now menopause is able to sit in that same space, which means it becomes part of how you understand what is happening to women in your organisation, particularly in mid-career, and how you explain that. So rather than this being something separate or additional to do, it becomes part of that wider picture, which is great. And I think that's where the shift is, because it moves it away from being something that's optional or informal into something that now contributes to how the organisation and its workforce makes decisions about it. And I think it also changes expectations slightly, because it's no longer just about having something in place. There is now an expectation that organisations will be able to say, this is what we're seeing, this is what we think is influencing it, and this is how we are responding in a way that shows that we've actually put some thought behind it and it's going to make a difference. And I do think it's important to say that most organisations are at the beginning of this. So if you've not done anything at all yet, but you know you need to, you're definitely not behind, you're not alone. Most organisations haven't. Very few have got this already worked out, hence the need for a formal plan, right? So it's not about getting it all right straight away. It's about recognising that this is now part of the new landscape and starting to think about how you want to approach it in a way that makes sense for your organisation. So I thought it would be worth taking a little step back and looking at the scale of this and why it's worth you paying attention from a business perspective. So at the moment, there are around 7 million women aged between 40 and 60 in the UK workforce. So that is a meaningful part, right, of this workforce. It's a big number. And in many cases, it is also a group that holds a huge amount of experience. People who have been in your business or maybe in your industry for a very long time, who understand how things work and and who are often leading teams or moving into more senior roles. Alongside that, around two-thirds of women say that that symptoms are affecting them negatively at work, having a negative impact. That's 67% of women reporting that symptoms are affecting them. Who knew, right? That it would be that high, because women aren't openly admitting it. They're not asking you for support or telling their managers why. This is all under the radar. So there is already a huge level of impact there that organisations may or may not be fully seeing. Then when we look at retention, around 1 in 6 women, so about 17% of women, are considering leaving their job because of a lack of support. So that's where this starts to become more immediate for us, because this is not a small number of people that are feeling dissatisfied. 17% is a big number of people that are considering walking away. That is a proportion of your workforce actively questioning whether they can stay. And on top of that, around 6% of women have already left their jobs because of their menopause symptoms, just like I did. So this is not a potential risk, it's something that is already happening. And once those individuals have left, the organisation doesn't always still connect that decision back to menopause. It's still being attributed to something else entirely. So, of course, the pattern can be there, but it's just not being fully recognised. And then there is another layer to this, and I didn't put it on the slide, but around 10% of women report that they're feeling discriminated against because of their menopause symptoms. And that introduces a different type of risk, because that's no longer just about retention or performance. That starts to move into employee relations, grievances, and potential legal exposure, which of course is what Nick will come on to in a bit. But when you look at these figures together, what you have is impact on work, pressure on retention, evidence of people already leaving, and a proportion of employees feeling that they are not being treated fairly. And that combination is what makes this relevant from an organisational perspective. So I really hope that that helps you understand the magnitude of the problem. But on the positive note, on the other side of that, over 80% of women say that they would be more likely to stay if they were better supported at work. So this is not a fixed outcome at all. There is so much we can do about this problem. It is really easy for us to sort this out if we put some thought into it. There is a clear relationship between how organisations respond and what happens next. And I think that's the point that is worth us really holding on to, because this isn't about us trying to solve everything. It is about recognising that this is already affecting part of your workforce, and that your response to it has a direct impact on whether they stay, how they perform, how they show up, and how they experience work. So if we take a look at the guidance itself, I think it's really important to be clear on what is actually being asked of you at this stage, because there's quite a lot of noise around this. Well, there might not be for you, but there is for me. I see menopause everything all day, every day on the internet. So it can very quickly start to feel bigger and more complicated than it actually is. So at its most basic level, the requirement is actually relatively simple. It's a minimum of 2 actions that are required. That is it, just 2 actions. One is linked to the gender pay gap and one is linked to menopause support. That is your baseline. Hopefully it's just the baseline and that we can go a bit further than that. So in reality, you don't need to put something large or complex or expensive in place immediately. We do, however, need to be able to show that these plans have been thought through properly. We've thought about it and we're taking some form of action. So the simplicity of the requirements gives organisations a huge amount of flexibility. You can meet that requirement in a relatively straightforward way. For example, you could introduce a menopause policy, or you could simply run an awareness session for your entire organisation. Both of those things would count. And for many organisations, that is going to feel like a really sensible place to start, and that is absolutely fine. But where I think organisations are going to get stuck is going straight from understanding the requirements to deciding on an action. So looking at the guidance and thinking, okay, right, well, we just need to put a policy in place, or let's run a session, without really stepping back and asking, what are we actually seeing in our organisation? Because most organisations in this space are already doing work around their gender pay gap. You're already analysing data, already thinking about progression and retention, and already being asked to explain what's happening. So menopause can just sit within that, particularly when you're looking at mid-career, so women in their 40s and 50s. At a point where they would typically be progressing into those senior roles. That's what I'm really wanting to protect, those women that are stepping up into those roles. And if something is happening at that stage that affects confidence, visibility, decision-making, all of those things that I have mentioned, that is going to have a knock-on effect on this. So it's not just for the individual, but it is for your organisation's leadership pipeline. So rather than starting with what action you should take, I think a more useful starting point might be, what is actually happening in our organisation at this stage of someone's career? Are people progressing in the way that you would expect them to? Are people staying? Are they stepping back? Are there patterns that you've seen but you haven't necessarily connected to this? Because once you understand that, the action is going to become much more targeted and much more relevant to the people within your organisation. And I think that's where the difference starts to show between different organisations. Some are just going to meet the requirement. That's absolutely fine if that's all you can do. But others are going to use this as an opportunity to look a little bit more closely at what's really happening and to put something in place that's actually going to support their workforce in a more meaningful way. And that really doesn't have to be complicated, but it does need to be thought through. And so once we've got that understanding, I think the next step is thinking about how you structure your response to it in a way that's manageable, but also gives you something that you can build on over time. So if we take that a step further, the guidance does give you a structure to work with. I don't know if any of you have read the guidance yet, but I think it's helpful to see it as a structure rather than a set of tasks, because on paper it is really quite straightforward. It talks about understanding needs, taking action, tracking outcomes, and then reviewing and improving over time. Most organisations will recognise that sort of cycle because this isn't unique to menopause at all. It's how you would approach most areas when you're trying to introduce change, right? The first part of the structure around understanding needs is probably the most important part, but is often the most overlooked because we're so quick to want to jump to actions, because it requires organisations to stop and look at what you actually have. So that might be around your absence, your data around absence, if I can get my words out, retention or turnover. It might be feedback from your employees. Maybe you've done an employment survey in the past that you can go back and see what was in there that you can use. It might be looking at how confident different parts of your organization feel in handling this. Do they know how to have a good conversation? It doesn't have to be a huge piece of work, but it does need to be enough to give you a sense of where to focus to make this meaningful. And then when you do move into the action, it becomes much easier to choose something that really fits your organization rather than just applying something generic that's just really ticking the box, which is what we want to try and avoid. Then we have the tracking element. So that doesn't have to be overly complex either, but it does mean thinking about what you would expect to see change over time, whether that is in absence patterns, whether it's in your retention, the feedback that you're getting, or even is it just how comfortable people feel in raising the topic within your organization. And then the final part is review. And that's about using what you've learned to adjust what you do next. So we're constantly wanting to go on this cycle of learning and reviewing, because it's not something that will be fully defined right at the start. This is something that will evolve over time as you learn and you understand what works. And I think the key point here is that even when organizations have all of these elements in place, the experience can still vary quite a lot because it depends on how consistently it is applied and how that's experienced day to day. So rather than thinking about this as something that you put in place once, it's going to be much more useful to think about it as something that is going to develop over time. This isn't going away. So as you understand more about what's actually happening in your organization, you can respond and adapt to that. So with all of that in mind, I think the question then becomes, well, where do we actually start then? And that is why I created a menopause readiness review. This is not a quick checklist. It's actually something that's quite structured, a piece of work that takes you through 5 key areas of your organization. So it's looking at things like leadership and culture, how consistent your approach is, if you have one, what's happening at a manager level, how support is actually working day to day, and how people access support when it becomes more complex. And within each of those areas, it doesn't just ask questions, it sets out what typically shows up when that area is underdeveloped in your business, what HR teams tend to observe in practice, and what stronger readiness might actually look like for you. So it's helping you do 2 things at the same time. It helps you to recognize the patterns that might already be there that you haven't noticed yet. And it gives you a clearer sense of what good could look like in your context. There will already be things happening, but they may be inconsistent, they might not be fully visible, or maybe not connected in ways that allows you to respond in a clear way. So this piece of work is designed to help you surface all of that, to give you a more structured view of where you are now, where there might be risk or exposure for you, and where it would make sense for you to put your attention first. Because don't forget, not everybody needs the education. They might be going out and doing that themselves, but the women, the senior women in your organization might need some one-to-one support. So what actually is required might be quite different to what you think is required. This also actually gives you something practical that you can take into any internal conversation. So if you need to go and be talking about budgets or why this is important for your organization now, this will help you structure that and have a good conversation around this. So I think rather than starting with what we should do, you're starting with a much clearer understanding of what's actually happening in your organization so that it really makes sense. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to scan the QR code on the screen. Once I have finished, I will also put a link in the chat for anybody that doesn't like using QR codes. I know we're not all a fan. It will take you to my website where you will be able to put your details in and download that review. So I'd really encourage you to do that and take the time to work it through properly. And then once you have done that, it will become so much easier to decide what best action is relevant for your organisation. And then just to finish off from me before I hand back over to Nick, I just want to say this really isn't about having just something in place. This is about creating something that is really clear enough, consistent enough, grounded enough in your organization that's actually going to be used and is going to make a difference, because that's what this is all about. And if you would like to talk that through with me in more detail for your organisation, maybe just to sense check where you are, and just to have a chat about what next steps might be, that QR code will take you through to my calendar so that you can book a 30-minute slot to have a chat with me. And again, I will put that link in the chat afterwards as well. So you'd be very welcome to book in and have a chat. And on that note, I will finish and hand back over to Nick.
Thanks, Angela. Brilliant stuff. So much good content there for everybody, and lots of engagement in questions in the chat already. I think we'll try and pick some of those up towards the end. I think I put a couple of links to the guidance that you were talking about, so the overview and also those action points.
Right.
And again, I've got a question for you at the end about the action points as well. But let's keep moving. I think also a couple of people have flagged issues with the QR code. So if you do have that link for your audit thing, that would be cool too. Hopefully,
lovely. Thank you. Don't know why that's not working.
Yeah, no probs. So okay, so we've talked about the action plans, and Angela set the scene there. The other thing that I meant to mention was I've put the link to our previous webinar on menopause in the chat too. That had a slightly different focus, and again was really informative in terms of the information that Angela was sharing, particularly around symptoms and impact of menopause and that kind of thing too. So do have a watch back of that as well. One of the things that I'm talking about today, and this is a bit of a recap on last time, is the kind of legal side, because although we have menopause action plans, we also have other protections for women in the workplace relating to this area. Angela's covered some of this already, so I'm going to move fairly quickly through the sort of Employment Rights Act stuff. It's just to say that actually we do have some guidance that the government have put up on the website earlier this month. It's not particularly user-friendly, if I'm really honest. I think Angela may or may not agree with that. But for example, the fact that I couldn't find the action points that people are supposed to be considering as part of the action plans on the website very easily seemed to me to suggest that it's not actually that user-friendly. But if you persevere with it, particularly if you're a larger employer that's going to have to do this stuff, it's certainly worth persevering with, and obviously chatting to Angela, because she's going to be much more user-friendly than the government website, as you might imagine. So we've got this now that the Employment Rights Act has progressed. We've got the guidance that came out earlier this month. And I guess my hope is that it will bring the impact of menopause into focus. I think Angela's right in flagging the fact that it comes as part of this wider focus on the gender pay gap as well, and that the government seemed to have kind of put the two together and decided that actually equality action plans, as they're kind of describing them, is a good idea. And I suppose, as Angela said, the fact that certain employers are already focusing on the gender pay gap might help ensure that people are actually doing this. We did have a question earlier about, who does this apply to, what size does it apply to, and so on, and whether it's appropriate for smaller employers, I think based on everything that Angela's just talked about, it seems to me whether you're a large or small employer, it's probably worth focusing on because of the impact that it will have on your people within the organization and, you know, retention of talent and so on. And productivity and performance is a theme that's come up both in the chat and will come up as part of the cases that I'm looking at. So the benefits, it seems to me, are very clear for employers in terms of, you know, regardless of what size employer you are. So that's just worth flagging. In terms of the legal bit that I wanted to just focus on briefly before we go to Q&A, menopause in itself is not a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. Okay, so the Equality Act, massive piece of legislation, sets out a whole range of protected characteristics as they're described, but menopause is not one of those. So in the main, the claims that we've seen, and we have seen a significant number of increase in the number of claims relating to menopause. The claims that we're seeing tend to focus around other protected characteristics, and they tend to be age, sex, and disability. So we're going to look at some cases in that space shortly. In terms of the disability protection, again, I kind of acknowledge as part of these sessions that not everybody will be entirely happy with the fact that menopause is being categorized in that way. But that is one of the ways that the case law has developed in terms of providing protection for women going through menopause and the symptoms that they're experiencing. And I think that just to kind of expand on that, the key really there is that the definition of disability is a legal definition that the employment tribunals will look at, and they will effectively match the symptoms that a person is experiencing, be it menopause or in fact any other condition, against that legal test. And they'll look at in brief terms whether it's having a long-term substantial impact on the person's ability to do day-to-day activities. And clearly, based on, you know, what you may already know about menopause and what Angela has shared, that fits that scenario. So lots of the cases when it comes to disability discrimination are focusing on that area because it's a mechanism for people to get that protection in the employment tribunal, as well as age and sex, and we'll look at those. But I wanted to kind of make it clear on the disability side what the focus tends to be when it comes to the employment tribunal. So when it comes to disability, we've got a couple of cases there, which I'm just going to talk you through. And the interesting thing about the definition of disability is that it's not always met. So depending on the severity of the symptoms often and the impact that they have on a person's ability to do their day-to-day activities, it may be that the same condition is experienced in a more severe way by some people over others. And that means that often the definition is met where the impact is particularly serious, but in other cases it won't be. And therefore, I think that the thing to remember is that it's not necessarily always going to be the case that somebody that's going through menopause, perimenopause, will qualify for protection under the Equality Act when it comes to that legal definition of disability, but often they will. And therefore, what the tribunals have to grapple with, which is what they grapple with any condition when it comes to disability discrimination, is on this occasion, on this particular set of facts for this particular person, does it meet the legal definition? And the Rooney case is an example of somebody who was experiencing pretty severe menopause symptoms, so hot flushes and memory loss and so on. And again, the judgment is worth a read. She was a social worker working for the county council, and essentially the initial stage of the employment tribunal, they decided that she didn't meet the definition. And she said, actually, I think you've applied the law wrong. And it went to what's called the Employment Appeals Tribunal. And they decided that actually the tribunal had got it wrong and that her symptoms met the legal definition. So that's, I think, one of the kind of leading cases, essentially, for it being the case that menopause can qualify as a disability and therefore give that protection. And in the direct line case, I often refer to it as a good example, but it's not good at all in the sense that the management of Miss Linsky in this scenario was not at all good. And she was, again, experiencing very severe menopausal symptoms affecting concentration and performance. And a bit like Angela had described as part of her introduction, she had been an incredibly high performer the majority of her career. And I think, actually there was a significant change in performance here. Now, there's a whole category of errors that were made in this particular case by the employer, but they didn't adjust the performance improvement process properly. They didn't take occupational health advice and so on. And they certainly didn't make adjustments, that were necessary in this kind of scenario. And the tribunal found on that occasion that actually that amounted to disability discrimination, and that there was a failure to make reasonable adjustments, and awarded £23,000 for injury to feelings. So the hurt feelings experienced by her as a result of the discrimination that had taken place. And again, it's a useful example because I think it's a reminder to employers that it's quite possible that a person will meet that definition, and therefore reasonable adjustments are necessary in that scenario. And I think that's something that I think employers are still missing, and not necessarily grasping the fact that actually there is risk there if sufficient adjustments are not made for women experiencing menopause. Age is the other claim, age discrimination, that women will often pursue as part of an employment tribunal claim. And again, these claims are not necessarily mutually exclusive in the sense that it may be that the same treatment is being cited as discrimination based on multiples of these, so disability, age, and sex, in theory, all in the same claim. But if we focus in on age, the McCabe case, again, not a particularly pleasant set of facts. I think she was subjected to derogatory comments about menopause, I think by the CEO in that particular business. And he would say things like, don't let your hormones get out of control, and that kind of thing. I think it also came out as part of the case that he had instructed a recruitment agent to find a younger employee to replace the eventual claimant. So clearly not appropriate in that scenario in lots of different ways. And the tribunal found that actually this was direct age discrimination and awarded £20,000 there in compensation. Now, actually, direct discrimination is pretty rare these days. That's very explicit in its nature, as in we are discriminating against you because of your protected characteristic, in this example, age. It tends to be less or it tends to be more subtle than that, where a policy is applied in a way that disadvantages somebody, or adjustments are not made, or so on. But actually this is an example of direct discrimination where it was very, very explicit in that scenario, and clearly opened up that employer to significant risk. Then the Bon Marché case, again, similar sort of situation where demeaning comments were made to the individual, and a refusal to adjust the workplace temperature. I think manager suggested that she was having a meltdown or these kind of things on a regular basis, and that was in that case found to be both sex and age harassment, so that effectively the employer had allowed or created an environment in which the harassment was taking place. And again, the award there is again nearly £20,000 in compensation in that scenario. So examples of protection on the grounds of age. And finally, sex discrimination. Again, the Merchant BT case, it was really an example of the importance, I suppose, of managers. Now, both Angela and I believe very much in upskilling managers well in this area, and on a whole host of other things as well, because they're the front line, for the employer's purposes in terms of managing people well. And we're doing lots of training for employers, on managers and HR teams and the like. But I think this is a prime example of a manager just getting it wrong, possibly through naivety and a lack of knowledge. And essentially, you know, they reference in this particular case that the manager involved here was very much relying on his own perception of what menopause was and how that might impact somebody. And instead of following the company's internal procedure, instead of getting external occupational health advice and so on, it was very much played down, I suspect, as a result of the lack of knowledge and naivety that manager demonstrated. So I think that, for me, is a classic example of you know, the need to ensure that there's a conversation around this area and that managers are properly equipped to deal with these situations and to have good conversations in this area. And I think, in fact, there was a question which we'll pick up as part of the Q&A earlier around that kind of issue. How to protect your organization. I've just talked about providing training to managers. I think culturally, also just taking this issue seriously, you know, from the top down, I think is important, like with most things. Then implementing clear workplace policies, maintaining, you know, good communication across the organization, and of course, voluntary menopause action plans, the whole gist of the session, it is a key thing. And again, I would sort of suggest that whether you've got 250 employees or not, that's something that, you know, it's worth considering very seriously. So that's a canter through some of the legal cases. We did want to make sure that we had plenty of time for questions towards the end. I can jump back into the chat and have a look. I've tried not to look at the chat while I was talking, but it may well be that there are some there. Angela, I don't know whether you spotted the question. I think it was from Sarah.
I've been working my way through.
Okay,
I won't answer them in the chat. I'll come on. So I'll go through some of the ones that I have got to so far. So you already mentioned this, but somebody asked if there is data around women who are losing their jobs. I'm not aware of any data on that. I haven't come across it, but I'm certainly going to go and have a look now and see if I can find any. But I have spoken to a lot of women that feel that they have pushed out. So when they come to me for coaching, they feel like they have been managed out of the business, and menopause hasn't necessarily been part of that conversation, but they are leaving on the understanding that they feel like they've had no choice. So in my experience personally, I wasn't pushed. I made the choice to go, but I am getting quite a lot of women coming to me feeling that they have had no choice because they have been pushed into it. So I do think that's a thing, but whether there's actually any data on that at the moment, I don't know. Ronnie asked about smaller organisations and whether there is any timeline around when that will be mandatory for them. I'm not aware of any. I haven't seen anything on that. So
no, me neither.
At the moment, yeah, it's just for organisations over 250. Obviously, from my point of view, I'm trying to encourage all organisations to do something, and there will be something that you can do within your budget if you have the culture in the organisation that allows you to put something in place, because every organisation will have a woman there that is either experiencing now or will be approaching the age where they might be. And someone very rightly said in the chat, this can happen at any age. And it really does happen. And I say this in a lot of my talks, that we talk about women in their 40s and 50s, but this is absolutely happening to women far, far younger. And we have to think about surgical and chemical menopause as well. And that can happen to women at any age. So the important thing is we can't make any assumptions about what any woman of any age is experiencing, because we just don't know what's happening behind the scenes. So we really do have to be all over that. And I would really encourage any smaller organisations to have a chat just to work out what good looks like for you, because it's really no different whatever size organisation you are, I think, personally. One of, I'm not sure if you can answer, Nick, because I'm actually not sure about this, but we were asked, one company, they are a combined group of 3 separate companies. So does that affect them, do they have to add all of those employees together, or is it each
Ooh, that
separate
is a good
company?
question.
I'm not entirely sure, but if each separate organisation is a separate legal identity, I would assume it would be each separate that
Yeah,
you're counting a number of employees.
that would be my guess too.
Yeah, but you definitely need to check that out.
Yeah,
And again, I will look into that, but I don't think there's any guidance on that.
Yeah, or if there is, it's buried in the guidance, like
buried in the
various
guidance,
other things.
which is, I agree, very hard to find. It took me quite a while to find all the different links. You feel like you can get lost in a sea of links on that government website.
Yeah.
But I have downloaded all of the guidance. So if anybody wants to, email me and say, can you send me the guidance? I will send you what I have
That's
downloaded.
a good idea.
I'm really happy to.
A PDF would be good, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Angela, did you see Sarah's question? So that was about managers initiating discussions about menopause.
Yes.
So I thought this was a really good one. So would you expect a line manager to initiate discussions about menopause if they're noticing changes in an employee's behavior, or is this more about being receptive and knowledgeable to discussions about menopause when an employee raises this? I'm slightly nervous about a manager being a bit clumsy or gung-ho about raising it. I think it's a really, really good question.
Absolutely great question. And I think you're right to be worried. And one of the reasons why manager training is one of the most important things that we can do so that they can understand how to approach the conversation, because ideally, if they know how to do that in an empathetic way and that they already have a good relationship with the woman, then absolutely, I think they could approach that conversation. But you wouldn't necessarily use the word menopause in that conversation. It's more about, I've noticed you seem different at the moment. Are you okay? Is there anything you need from me? Is there anything the organisation can do for you? They're the sort of questions that we would be encouraging managers to have, and building those relationships with their team members, that the team member feels that they can go and have that conversation. And I know that's very tricky, and it's that relationship is not always there, but what we want to encourage is managers across the organization to be able to have that conversation with anybody, because I know from previous experience I've had managers that I might not be willing to speak to my manager, but I would have been willing to speak to another manager within the organization that I had a good relationship with. So it's about making sure you've got the right people across the organization, both male and female, that are capable of having these conversations, which again is why lots of larger organizations actually are opting to train menopause champions, so that they have specific people that you can go to and have that trusted conversation. And a menopause champion would probably be able to have that conversation on the side with the woman and said, I've noticed this about you. Is there anything that we can do? Is that, can we help you? Is there anything you want to chat to me about? So I think it's never going to be easy, but that's how I would come about it.
Yeah, and I agree, Angela. I think actually managers just showing a level of concern about their people can't be a bad thing.
Yeah.
And you're right, they don't have to hone in on one particular issue, be it menopause or anything else, because of course there's a whole range of things that might be impacting somebody's performance. Menopause might be one of them, but certainly saying, as you described, those kind of open questions about how can we help you, hopefully will, be enough to be supportive for sure.
Yeah. I'm just replying to Julie in the chat. So Julie, if you wouldn't mind emailing me so that I have got your email address, and then I will be able to send you on the information for that. I'm assuming it's the guidelines you want from the government, which I'll be happy to send on to you. So if you just email me, it's angela@greenpathcoaching.com, which you'll also find on my website. So
fab.
Someone asked a question about adjustments. That was one of the last questions in the chat, around teaching and lecturing. So people that aren't necessarily in an office environment, and it's much more difficult to put reasonable adjustments in place. And absolutely, that is true, especially for people that are working also in call centres or on factory floors. Much more difficult to be able to offer flexible working and all of the easier things that are able to put in place. I would say you specifically asked about teachers and lecturers. I would say ask them what they need is the best thing you can do. Don't assume what they need, ask them what they need. And if all they're asking for is more flexibility and you can't do that, then unfortunately that will be, it is what it is in that type of workplace. You don't have to offer flexibility for everything. It has to be reasonable for them and the organization. So you don't have to just give everything. It's got to be reasonable for you. But you can do smaller things. Is there cold water available near the lecture room that they're in? Are they able to go and top that up? Can you think about whether there is assistant available that will allow them to pop out of the lecture midway through so that they can go and use the bathroom if they need to? Is it okay for them to leave the lecture room midway through? How can you make that a possibility? Because for a woman who might be struggling with heavy or unpredictable periods, being able to leave that room is going to be super important for her. So how can you make that a possibility for her? So again, there's no easy answers, but the best thing you can do is be talking to your employees to find out what their experience is and what would make it easier for them.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that all makes sense. I think the other thing that I would expect to see would be occupational health support. I think increasingly occupational health providers are cottoning on to the fact that this is a thing, finally, and that actually not only are you getting then feedback from the individual, which I completely agree with Angela, is a very good way of doing it, but you're also getting a feedback from them, as well as that kind of medical view as well, which is really helpful, I think. And again, from an employer perspective, it's very much then, you've done what you can to ensure that you have all the information that you need, because the thing with reasonable adjustment stuff that I always come back to is employers are not medical experts, and actually employees, even though they're going through something, menopause or otherwise, won't always know exactly what might be helpful for them. That's the point of occupational health.
Yeah.
So neither side are actually medical experts. And if you're then getting some good medical input, it might well be the case that they suggest something that neither employee or employer might have come up with. So that's what I would certainly suggest. Again, a shout out for Smart Clinic, who are an occupational health provider that I've found to be very reliable and actually answers questions in a way that is useful for employers. So do check them out. Smart Clinic, they're a good website too, for both one-off occupational health referrals and a kind of annual support if that's what you need.
And if I could just follow up on that, so if there's any organisations out there at the moment that don't have occupational health, or that isn't an option for you right now, there are many people like me, but I also offer menopause audits for women. So they're 1-to-1, 1-hour sessions where women chat to me about their symptoms, and they are the sorts of things that we can cover in those conversations. So definitely worth thinking about offering things like that 1-to-1 support where they can go and have that conversation, because exactly the point that's just been put in the chat around GPs having zero training, and women are having to go in excess of 7 occasions to their GP to get any kind of support, and that is absolutely true, no word of a lie. Women are having to go back over and over again and are being ignored. So if they're not getting the support that they need from their GP, they can come to menopause audits with someone like me. I can't give them the prescription if it's HRT that they're looking for, but I can be setting them up to have a really good conversation with you as their employer as to what they need, but also having a good conversation with their GP on understanding their symptoms and being able to walk into that appointment knowing exactly what they want to come away with and be able to advocate for themselves to get what they need in the moment. And for anybody that hasn't noticed it, I put the link in the chat earlier for all of my other guides because you were having trouble with the form. Apologies about that. There is the perimenopause clarity checker in there. Now you can just download that for free and allow your employees to be able to use that, and they can check and they can take those clarity checkers to their GP appointments that shows the experiencing that the symptoms that they're experiencing and the severity of those symptoms. And it's really helpful part of that conversation with the GP to go in there and say, I've done my research, I know what I need, this is what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sarah's also highlighting the alternative is pay an absolute fortune for a private menopause GP, which actually was our experience too. That's where we ended up going, in a bit of an emergency situation for that reason.
And what a lot of women think that they can do is go, and this is the case for a lot of women, they think they can go to a private appointment once, get the prescription that they're after, and then that prescription gets sent across to their NHS GP, and that NHS GP should continue with that prescription. But I'm hearing more and more that that's not the case, and women are having to continue to pay to get their prescriptions privately, which is criminal.
Yeah.
There is also in the UK a menopause prepayment certificate. So no woman should be paying more than £20 a year for every single prescription that you get that is related to hormone replacement therapy. So, you know, even things like that sort of information that you can be sharing with your employees, that's the sort of thing that can go in your policy, to tell them that this is the support that's available. Don't be paying every time. There you go, Kelly. Oh my God, really? And people are paying every time they go, and it costs a fortune. So it's actually, yeah, £30 for a month, and it's £20 for the year. So you just go to the NHS website, search for prepayment certificates. You will see one there specifically for HRT. Time it well. So do it just before you're about to go and get a new prescription, so that you don't waste 3 months of your prepayment certificate. Download that, and you can just tell your pharmacy that you have the prepayment certificate, and that's valid for a year.
Yeah, our pharmacist told us about it, which I thought was great. Yeah, when we rocked up, but clearly the message is not out there, given some of the comments we're getting in the chat.
No, absolutely. Yeah,
because we thought, well, that seems too good to be true, and the pharmacist was like, well, no, it's there for a reason.
Yeah, it came in a couple of years ago, and this is what's happening. Stuff is happening out there that we're not told. So it's just, you know, we're constantly having to keep repeating the points so that everybody gets to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And testosterone is on the prepayment certificate. I'm on testosterone through my NHS GP, and that is covered on my HRT certificate. So if you're being told it's not, I don't think that's right, because I'm definitely getting it.
Fab.
Were there any more questions?
I was just trying to scan back through.
Oh, it's a great point on the menopause cafes. I talk about the menopause cafes in my awareness sessions quite a lot, because they are up and down the country. So most towns have one. You're right, they're probably not everywhere. But if you're near a large enough town, you probably will find one. And they're free to attend, and they're so good for finding women local to you who are experiencing the same thing. So if you don't have somebody that you can really talk to about this, either at home or at work, and you're going through it and feeling lonely, menopause cafes are a great place to go and find your people and get really good quality information from people that work in this space. Thank you for sharing the link.
Yeah, fab. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we'll probably call it a day there, Angela. We could probably talk for another couple of hours, I would think.
You know me, Nick. We'll keep going.
But it's great, and I always thoroughly enjoy hearing you talk about this topic and helping get the message out, which it feels like we have done today. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks to everybody who joined the session. You will get the recording, as I mentioned at the beginning, so that you can watch back or potentially share with colleagues, friends, partners, whatever it might be. I think it's useful for so many people. We are running, Actons are running another webinar later this week on redundancy and restructure, which is quite a shift from menopause. But if that would be helpful, there is still time to sign up for that later this week, and I've popped a link to that in the chat too. And I know Angela is doing all sorts of fab stuff as well. So do make sure you follow her on LinkedIn. Again, I put her profile link in the chat much earlier on in session 2. So do connect with her and follow on her stuff too. Yeah. Great. Okay, we'll call it there. Thanks again, Angela. Take care, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you for coming.